Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Tacky's Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War, by Vincent Brown. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Prologue. The Path to Rebels' Barricade. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Isaiah, chapter 19, verse 2. Wager, also known by his African name, Apongo, was a leader of the largest slave rebellion in the 18th century British Empire. But long before taking his part in the great Jamaican insurrection of 1760 to 1761, commonly called Tacky's Revolt, he had been on a remarkable odyssey. Apongo had been a military leader in West Africa during a period of imperial expansion and intensive warfare there. During this time, he had even been a notable guest of John Cope, a chief agent of Cape Coast Castle, Britain's principal fort on the Gold Coast. Captured and sold at some point in the 1740s, Apongo became the property of Captain Arthur Forrest of HMS Wager, who renamed him for the Royal Navy warship. Wager came in bondage to Forrest's plantation in Westmoreland Parish, Jamaica, where he again encountered John Cope, who had retired to his own Jamaican estate. Occasionally, Cope would entertain his acquaintance from the Old World, laying at table for week-end visits, treating the slave as a man of honor, and insinuating that Apongo would one day be redeemed and sent home. Whatever understanding there was between the two men did not outlast John Cope's death in 1756. In the ensuing years, Wager began plotting and organizing a war against the whites, and awaiting an opportune moment to strike. Taking advantage of Britain's 7 years' war against its European opponents, Wager and more than 1,000 other enslaved black people on the island engaged in a series of uprisings, which began on April 7, 1760, and continued until October of the next year. Over those 18 months, the rebels managed to kill 60 whites and destroy tens of thousands of pounds worth of property. During the suppression of the revolt and the repression that followed, over 500 black men and women were killed in battle, executed, or driven to suicide. Another 500 were transported from the island for life. Considering the extent and secrecy of its plan, the multitude of the conspirators, and the difficulty of opposing its eruptions in such a variety of different places at once, wrote one planter who lived through the upheaval, this revolt was more formidable than any hitherto known in the West Indies. According to two slaveholders who wrote histories of the conflict, the rebellion arose at the instigation of an African man named Tacky, who had been a chief in Guinea, and was organized and executed principally by people called Coromantees, or Coromantees, from the Gold Coast, the West African region stretching between the Comoy and Volta rivers, who had an established reputation for military prowess. Slaveholders knew these Africans to be rebellious, and their notoriety has endured to this day. Wager's involvement in the revolt might further justify this martial reputation, but it is also part of a less familiar story. Although we are accustomed to hearing about rebels reacting against their enslavement by rising up against their masters, and about elite people in Africa falling into the hands of slavers, rarely have these accounts acknowledged the complex patterns of alliance and antagonism over time and great distance that defined relationships like those among Apongo, John Cope, and Arthur Forrest. Recognizing how life histories like theirs, stories of displacement, belonging, and political predicament, were intertwined helps us understand how the slave trade triggered the diasporic warfare that both created and convulsed the 18th century Atlantic world. Apongo's Atlantic Odyssey spans the martial geography of Atlantic slavery, highlighting the entanglement of African and European empires with the massive forced migrations of the 18th century, and suggesting a new way to understand slave insurrection. Rather than a two-sided conflict between masters and slaves, the 1760 to 1761 revolt was the volatile admixture of many journeys and military campaigns. The people who took part in it traveled far and endured many turns of fortune, entangling their numerous episodes into a single story. In its causes and consequences, What we know as Tacky's revolt combined the itineraries of many people: merchants, planters, imperial functionaries, soldiers and sailors from Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean, and enslaved men, women, and children, all engaged in life-and-death struggles to accumulate wealth, build state power, strike for freedom, or merely survive. The transatlantic slave trade extracted people from a vast region of Atlantic Africa and spread them throughout the Americas. People who had been administrative or military leaders suddenly found themselves uprooted from sustaining landscapes, scattered by currents and trade winds, and replanted in strange territories where they labored to build new social lives and regain a level of influence. Inevitably, some of them concluded that only war could end their enslavement. Mostly, it was common people who found themselves caught up in slaving raids and expansionary wars, cast across the ocean, and set down in alien lands where slaveholders exploited and brutalized them. When new conflicts promised to liberate them or offered rewards for serving their masters, slaves might take up arms for whichever faction presented the prospect of a better life. This process of dispersal from a native land, transplantation and adaptation to a new and strange one is familiar to students of cultural change who pull African, American, and Atlantic history into one large common frame to see larger-scale patterns of transformation in African religion, expression, and identity. A similarly expansive approach can reveal how the turmoil of enslavement and the daily hostilities of life and bondage ignited a militant response that erupted in widespread rebellions reverberating across the Americas and back to Europe. The effect when Africans from the Gold Coast staged a series of revolts and conspiracies in the 17th and 18th centuries, most dramatically in Cartagena de Indias, Suriname, St. John, New York, Antigua, and Jamaica, was to form an archipelago of insurrections stretching throughout the North Atlantic Americas. The Jamaican insurrections of 1760 to 1761, and further uprisings there in 1765 and 1766, were among the largest and most consequential of these. The aims and tactics employed by the rebels made it clear to observers that many had been soldiers in Africa. As John Thornton has argued, Africans with military experience played an important role in revolts, if not by providing all of the rebels, at least by providing enough to stiffen and increase the viability of revolts. Beyond one or two exceptional leaders, whole cadres of people had military training and discipline, or had at least gained knowledge of defensive tactics in Africa. Indeed, many American slave revolts might be seen as extensions of African wars. Casting them as such does more than assert the importance of Africa in the making of the Atlantic world. It helps to reveal how complex networks of migration, belonging, trans-regional power, and conflict gave the political history of the 18th century some of its distinctive contours. Recognizing slave revolt as a species of warfare is the first step toward a new cartography of Atlantic slavery. The former slave and veteran of the 7 Years' War, Gustavus Vassa, now commonly known by his African name, Olaudah Equiano, famously defined slavery itself as a perpetual state of war. This was not war in the conventional sense, however, involving disciplined armies directed by the rulers of states. Rather, it was the simmering violence inherent in mastery, by its nature of forceful assault, and the slave's countervailing resentment of slaveholders' fraud, rapine, and cruelty. Equiano echoed the English philosopher John Locke, who argued in the late 17th century that the perfect condition of slavery was nothing but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. To be sure, while Locke extolled freedom as humankind's natural condition and consent as the basis of all government, his theory clashed with his practice. He invested in slave trading and slave-holding enterprises, and looked upon war captives as a legitimate source of slaves who would remain outside of political society. Equiano, by contrast, pointed directly at the practical, daily war that defined any society afflicted by slavery. To the slaveholders, Equiano asked, "Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection?" It was not a rhetorical question. Since the early years of Jamaica's slave society, slaveholders had often considered the enslaved as irreconcilable and yet intestine enemies, subjected to the colonists' will only by the rule of the whip. The prospect of slave rebellion was a perennial anxiety, a war always the more terrible, one slaveholder wrote, by how much there is no quarter given in it. Equiano visited Jamaica in 1772 as a free man, and he found the island still reeling from the slave uprisings of the previous decade. There he saw how an entire society could be organized around violence and counterattack on every level, from the quotidian to the epic. It was an observation shared by black people in other times and places. Conditions of bondage were often characterized as a permanent state of low-intensity war, with the enslaved regularly talking about how to wage that war. The martial characteristics of Atlantic slavery deserve closer inspection. Acts of resistance to slavery are commonly thought of as falling along a single continuum. At one end of the struggle for freedom are everyday assertions of independent will and volition, such as malingering in the fields, breaking tools, or pilfering from masters, while violent collective uprisings like the ones led by Tacky and Upongo lie at the other end. There is some value in seeing these insurrections as different in scale, but not in kind from less dramatic refusals of slaveholders' authority. It allows us to understand the variety and consistency of slaves' oppositions to slaveholders. At the same time, however, this framing is too reductive. It masks the complexity of large revolts, glosses over the multiple aspirations of rebels, confines the contest to circumscribed locations, and forecloses important questions about planning, strategy, tactics, and claims to territory, the very questions we ask about wars. The Jamaican insurrections that began in 1760 clearly constituted resistance. More concretely, they were acts of war. They featured a kind of fighting that has become familiar to military theorists, the kind that involves improvised militias dispersed over wide areas taking up arms against great powers, with largely undefined battle lines and blurred distinctions between civilians and combatants. Viewing the revolt as a war, as its combatants did, helps us to see connections and dynamics that signal far more than the insubordination and defiance of slave resistance. The struggle ranged well beyond the limits of plantations, colonies, or states to encompass and integrate entire regions. As much as it grew out of plantation slavery's inherent everyday violence, it was sustained by imperial militarism and broader transformations of commerce, governance, and cultural belonging. It was more than a local outburst, more than a continuation of prior experience, and it involved a far larger and more diverse cast of players than studies of resistance normally feature. It was the kind of event best narrated as a war story. Warfare migrates. This has never been more apparent than in the era when the violence of imperial expansion and enslavement transformed Europe, Africa, and the Americas as they interacted across the Atlantic Ocean. European imperial conflicts extended the dominion of capitalist agriculture. African battles fed captives to the transatlantic trade in slaves. Masters and their captives struggled with one another continuously. These clashes amounted to borderless slave war, war to enslave, war to expand slavery, and war against slaves, answered on the side of the enslaved by war against slaveholders, and also war among slaves themselves. In this sense, the Jamaican slave revolt of 1760 to 1761 was a war within an interlinked network of other wars which had diverging and overlapping provocations, combat zones, political alliances, and enemy combatants. In effect, it was part of 4 wars at once. It was an extension of wars on the African continent. It was a race war between black slaves and white slaveholders. It was a struggle among black people over the terms of communal belonging, effective control over local territory, and establishment of their own political legacies. And it was, most immediately, one of the hardest-fought battles of that titanic global conflict between Britain and its European rivals that would come to be known as the 7 Years' War. Each of these 4 wars introduced different currents that converged and eddied in the Jamaican insurrections of the 1760s. To chart their flows, a new cartography of slave revolt is required, one that combines the histories of Europe, Africa, and America, and makes room for new stories of place, territory, and movement. To map the hemispheric reach of a slave war, we must see the interlocking patterns of state, commerce, migration, labor, and militancy formed by a multitude of journeys. These patterns present themselves differently with changes in the scale and scope of our examination. A scale that encompasses large regions and historic transformations complements a narrower focus on the contingent experiences of individual captives, colonists, bureaucrats, soldiers, and seamen. Both are necessary if we are to understand how slaving raids, racial conflict, communal hostilities, and the 7 Years' War created a theater of combat as dynamic as the winds, currents, and weather patterns of the Atlantic Ocean itself. Across vast distances, these wars within wars connected the constituent elements of empire, diaspora, and insurrection. An integrated history of slave revolt that considers its sources, circuits, and reverberations will take us far from the plantations, beyond relations between masters and slaves, and outside the conventional locations for observing racial violence. Vectors of slave war in Jamaica formed a knot in the intertwined itineraries of soldiers who fought in Europe, North America, and Africa, sailors who crisscrossed the Atlantic world for merchants and empires, and slaves who were swept up in many conflicts on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Mapping the movements of profiteers, warlords, workers, refugees, and ordinary fighters exposes the shape of a martial archipelago made up of peaks bearing witness to the great volcanic forces of world history operating below. Slave revolt was a race war to the extent that it concerned relations between masters and their vassals. From the 15th century onward, skin color was used as a primary index of social status, with blackness becoming increasingly synonymous with slavery over time. By the 18th century, in British America especially, white people had come to expect that blacks existed to serve their material, sexual, and psychic desires. In slave society like those in the Caribbean and southern North America, whites thought of themselves as collectively belonging to a ruling race. Often outnumbered by their desperate slaves, the colonists developed elaborate regimes of terror to keep them in submission. On rare occasions, when opportunities arose, slave rebels responded in kind. Slave revolts and conspiracies were usually put down quickly and brutally by slaveholders on the outlook for the total onslaught by angry black people they anticipated might come. The 1760 to 1761 revolt in Jamaica was more exemplary than exceptional because it represented the sum of their fears. Occurring 3 decades before the 1789 to 1804 Haitian Revolution destroyed Europe's most profitable colony in the Americas, neighboring French Saint-Domingue, this Jamaican conflict suspended life as colonists knew it, violating domestic order, halting business, and promising the end of their prestige. It threatened a remapping of colonial America as African territory where white rule would have no sway. The British devoted great energy and spent considerable sums to fortify their society against this prospect. Enslaved Africans did indeed have their own designs on Jamaica's landscape, guided by their experiences of enslavement and their understanding of the possibilities for escape. They envisioned moving freely through the terrain that lay beyond the slave master's control, seeing in the forests and mountains a world apart from the plains and valleys stamped with agricultural estates, where communities of runaways might turn natural dangers to their defensive advantage. They also saw, even within the slaveholder's domain, chances to repurpose small spaces into places where they could protect their collective sense of self-worth from daily assault, and dreamed of building their own societies, even on the site of their bondage. These visions for the island were shaped, as they were for whites, by the long history of violent transformations that attended the slave trade. Wars were principal conduits and facilitators of Atlantic commerce and created favorable conditions for proliferating aggression. Military conquests secured new markets and new captured and coerced labor forces, while troops guaranteed the viability of trade. The eminent scholar W.E.B. Du Bois clearly recognized how war laid the foundations of commercial production systems with hidden costs of sweat, blood, death, and despair. Following Du Bois, historians writing on colonial slavery in the radical tradition, such as C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, and Walter Rodney, have insisted that the slave trade was the strongest cord binding the region together, the stimulus for economic growth, and a principal cause of enduring inequalities. The slave trade linked European commerce and colonial development to the political history of African wars, which produced a majority of the captives sold on the coast, both by taking prisoners of war and by creating conditions such as drought, famine, and failed government that drove people from their homes and made them vulnerable to predation. Given this tight linkage of war, enslavement, and economic expansion, the history of Africa must be understood as an integral part of the development of European empires. To do their work, slave traders on the Gold Coast needed at least some knowledge of African political territory. Early in their trade with Atlantic Africa, Europeans who knew little more than the coastal silhouette of the continent produced speculative maps of the polities they encountered or heard about from informants. They tried to discover which rulers to flatter, who controlled access to the best trade routes, and who was preparing for battle, since wars yielded human commodities. As the Europeans vied for trade, they took turns ousting each other from their forts, raising a series of flags to signal their shifting possession to local African envoys and to the ships bobbing offshore. Making up a jagged line along the coast, these little garrisons were the sites where captives marched from the interior met their European incarceration. From there they were wedged into the holds of slave ships for their journeys to the Americas. Already victimized by slaving wars and torn from their ancestral communities, now they faced the challenges of forging new ways of belonging suited to the New World's race wars. Black people's struggles to order their communities in the Americas often turned violent. Historians have commonly cast Coromantees slave revolts as the quintessential African rebellions, the most spectacular examples of national or ethnic revolt, because they were organized and executed principally by people from a single broad linguistic region. But these uprisings featured dynamics more fraught and complicated than this characterization allows. Far from a unified African ethnic group with a clear sense of identity, Coromantees were divided along multiple lines. There were political struggles among those Gold Coast Africans who had been pitted against each other in old world wars, among strangers thrown together into colonial slavery's crucible of misery, between black people born in Africa and those born in America, and among Coromantees with conflicting interests and beliefs. Even in the context of a joint fight against enslavement, Coromantee insurrections featured all of these tensions. To assume the coherence of the Coromantee ethnic group is to obscure the internal turbulence that affected the course of their crusades. All the Africans brought to America were shaped by past societies and experiences. Understanding these helps us to trace the influences of African history on America and of American history on Africans. Among the strongest of these influences were their experiences of warfare, dislocation, and social regeneration, which continued in the American slave societies. Slaves differed from and resembled each other along multiple axes, including not only their languages, spiritual beliefs and practices, ideals for gender relations, and contingent political allegiances, but also the ways in which they were subject to the prerogatives of slaveholders, the social roles required by the labor regime, and the operations of colonial security. No single fact of identity determined how people responded to enslavement. They adopted various and conflicting positions, leading to political conflict among slaves and between slaves and free blacks. To appreciate how the African rebels in Jamaica managed to mobilize a scattered array of co-nationals to wage war against their era's most powerful Atlantic empire, and why so many other black people stood against them or stood to the side, we must examine how they adjusted to their novel circumstances by making new identifications and affinities, regrouping together in new political communities. Struggles over communal belonging were not only part of the larger enterprise of ethnic group formation, or what has been called ethnogenesis. They were also present in intimate spaces and close interactions. in slave quarters and slaveholders' homes, at work and in the fields, in port towns and aboard ships, and along the pathways connecting parts of the island. In every place one could read and interpret signs of difference and similarity, of deference and disrespect. People created what the historian Stephanie Camp has termed rival geographies, engaging in the politics of place that would attach meaning to their surroundings. Across the island, people maintained a warring intimacy in which adversarial claims relating to shared territory arose from individuals' deep and differing senses of privilege, morality, and justice. Much easier to map than these communal struggles are the land claims of nations, states, and empires. Having been Spanish territory before 1655, Jamaica was captured in that year by the English and became one of the kingdom's most valuable possessions. Throughout Britain's frequent wars against the Dutch, Spanish, and French, the island presented a tempting target and was thus heavily fortified against attack. Yet the most serious challenge to British sovereignty in Jamaica came not from European rivals, but from Africans and their descendants. Black rebels fragmented the territory of colonial control throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and were positioned to take the entire island during the 7 Years' War, or so the slaveholders feared. The 7 Years' War was a global conflict with enormous consequences, but historians have barely noticed that the Jamaican insurrection was one of its major battles. The most comprehensive accounts of the war focus mainly on the rivalry among Europeans, giving due consideration to Native American nations in North America, but ignoring the Jamaican rebellion completely. Historians of the British Army during the period have expressed doubt that the military learned much from deployments in the Caribbean. Even the most important interpretations of racial attitudes in Anglo-American warfare in the era neglect the suppression of slave uprisings. The tendency is for chronicles to segregate the Slaves' War from the British campaign for the West Indies. The prodigious corpus of British military history includes scant reference to the suppression of slave revolts in Jamaica, despite the island's status as the most militarily significant colony in 18th century British America. Common combatants were more observant. Some of the very same soldiers, sailors, and Marines who waged the most famous battles of the 7 Years' War in Quebec, Senegal, Martinique, and Guadeloupe went on to fight against Jamaica's rebels. There is nothing surprising about troops being deployed to multiple theaters, yet in this case the troops' experiences did not generate anything like a codified counterinsurgency strategy. Perhaps this is the reason that neither the military historians concerned with officially acknowledged wars nor the scholars of slave resistance focusing on local freedom struggles have devoted much attention to the way these small, dirty wars epitomized the relationship between trade, labor, and imperial power. Every slave revolt drew a congeries of participants into close engagements, but the rebels' stories must be learned mainly from the records left by their enemies. The powerful people of the time and their scribes were quick to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate combatants, and their documents treat slave insurgents with disdain. Likewise, the collecting practices of historical repositories, whether state or family-owned, have traditionally been guided by patrons with settled understandings of the world. Materials testifying to untidy popular politics rarely fit the established narratives of nations, peoples, and historic events. Slave revolts can look isolated and insignificant in retrospect because, with the exception of the great uprising that created the nation-state of Haiti, they seem to have mattered mostly to local people on their estates or in their individual colonies, and to have been of little long-term consequence. This misimpression is partly due to the paucity of written sources produced by black people at the time. The government officials, slave-trading merchants, planter diarists, property-owning correspondents, colonial printers, and Christian missionaries whose inscriptions fill the archives were not primarily concerned with the politics of the enslaved. These writers discussed their own plans and maneuvers, competed with each other, and fretted over the great many things that could cause their endeavors to fail. Even where we find colonists writing directly about slave revolts, their comments betray an eagerness to move on to other topics. Black lives mattered mostly to the extent that they satisfied a desire.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?